Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, virologists are jumping for joy as bird flu has finally made its jump from birds to cows and now humans. In further news that could be interesting, at least if you want to avoid sex, sex can trigger significant headaches, and so much so that it could be considered dangerous. Arguments as to why it is that tattoos are not going to help your immune system, no matter how you try and argue it. A gel that could deal with alcohol and help it break down in the human body, partly avoiding hangovers, but also more significant when it comes to overdose. The Guardian oversells the risk of drug-resistant bacteria and just how we can deal with them. A plastic that will effectively disappear once you stop needing it. YouTube proposes the use of a citation-like system for YouTube articles or videos. It's going to prove to be a challenge, let's say. The relationship between humanity, artificial intelligence, and moral tests, and whether or not AI is already capable of lying and deceiving us as a species. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the next likely candidate for a massive disease that will have us going into lockdown and otherwise having to deal with nonsense once more. Bird flu, specifically the A H5N1 strain of bird flu. Ironically enough, this particular strain started circulating around 2020, a year that we'll all remember. Alongside it beginning to circulate, we had the other joys associated with 2020. But like the other joys of 2020, this one continues to be a gift. The gift that keeps on giving. What we've had to worry about so far has been fairly low-level nonsense though. It's largely been cows being infected by the bird flu virus, and both decreasing dairy yield, but also producing milk that can't be consumed until it has been processed, and even then you probably don't want to. There hasn't been a lot of trouble though beyond this, as most of the infections have been more or less birds to cows, but it's never made the jump to humans. Or more accurately, there's never been a jump from birds to mammals of non-human type to humans. And that was the big hurdle. In fact, it was the biggest worry, because once the virus can go from infecting another mammal, the probability of it infecting a human is significantly more. But as long as it doesn't happen, we didn't have to worry. Until now. Now, unfortunately, a cow has infected a human with the virus, or at least so says the CDC. The worry at this point is, let's say, simple in its nature, but significant in its ramifications. This is the second suspected case of infection, but only the first definitively diagnosed case of infection. And it means that we now need to worry about the possibility of a human-to-human transmission. And therein lies the crux of the problem. At the moment, and let's be very clear about this, it's as of the time of this recording, human-to-human transmission has not happened. But, as you can probably imagine, the more humans that get infected, the more likely it is that human-to-human transmission will occur. And therein lies the problem. The more dairy farmers, or workers on dairy farms at least, who are exposed, the greater the risk they'll get infected, and therefore the greater the risk that jump in infectious ability will be. Which, yeah, that'll be fun when it happens. In other fun events, we have sex. Well, specifically, the unwanted results of sex, and we're not talking about pregnancy. In this case, we're specifically talking about the fact that sex can trigger headaches, practically verging on migraines. And it's not just an excuse not to have sex, as TV would have us believe, but a actual phenomena that occurs. The proper name for this is primary headache-associated sexual activity, or FASA, and it has at least two occurrences either following or during sex. These are pain that occurs in the head or neck and are not necessarily occurring due to something like fellatio. Rather, it's during and often a result of orgasm. The pain itself, in the form of a headache, can last for between a minute or two, up to 3 or 4 days in the most extreme cases. The exact cause isn't so well known, although there are some reasonably solid theories. One has found that a venous stenosis, or a narrowing of the veins, is a thing that occurs when there's exertion around the neck area. Depending on the kind of sexual activity we're talking about, that's entirely possible. But it could also be triggered simply by the significant increase in blood flow during more conventional sex, let's say. And so, because of this, there's an alteration in blood flow to the brain, and when that blood flow is altered, headaches can occur. The extensive duration, however, is a slightly different question, as, well, up to 4 days of this is not only a miserable time for all, compared to the relatively brief good time, but it also means that, theoretically, for up to 4 days, there is a reduction in blood flow to the brain, and not the other brain that you might be thinking of. As the conversation goes into a much greater detail on, this can also trigger other effects. Some of them are more serious than others, such as stroke, heart attack, and, in some extreme cases, aneurysm. So it's worth having a quick chat to your doctor about this if it does indeed happen. In other sex-related news, although this time we're talking biological sex, there are distinct differences between the male and female brain. And we're not just talking about what they focus on, but actual neuroanatomy. And so, it's kind of important that people recognize this. You don't have to like it, you don't necessarily have to agree with it, but you do have to recognize it. And when we do look at the two sexes, it's not always clear just what the boundaries are between these two. But if you do look at a large enough sample set, you find that there are statistical differences, particularly in where, what, and how in the brain, and this does have an effect on the traits of the sexes as they exhibit them. This is an important thing to point out here. Although, like with other traits, such as the physical anatomy, it's more appropriate to say that there are two bell curves of male and female. And although they are different, they're only slightly offset in some respects. And because of this, there's a lot of overlap in the middle, with gradually less out to the sides. This brings us to the more detailed study that science-based medicine discusses in a blog post. The key thing that they look at is a recent study. The study was, strengthened by 3 major elements. And these 3 elements are its use of an MRI scanning technology that is able to look at the brain on a much more, advanced level than previous studies have done. The second is that it used diffusion MRI scanning. That is, it's able to monitor how quickly and in which way water molecules move through parts of the brain. And then finally, it used, to a certain extent, AI to be able to, analyze the significance of this. Calling it AI, as we've mentioned previously, is a kind of a misnomer, as it's more accurate to say it's machine learning. But, a pet peeve aside, the model that they developed could tell the difference between a male and a female up to 98% of the time. Although, importantly, at the low end, it was 92% of the time, so given that we're talking about the brain and, all of its various intricacies, that's pretty damn good. It is, important to note that this study, although able to tell you that a fully developed adult is a male or a female 98% of the time, isn't necessarily all that helpful. Knowing that a fully grown male is a male and a fully grown female is a female isn't that hard in most cases, and in terms of biology, not necessarily all that helpful. It's understanding how you go from, a early child, or even better yet, a embryo, into a fully grown adult and the various changes in the brain structures along the way that are more important. It comes down to things like hormones, environment, drugs or toxins, depending on how you want to view the environment, and so on and so forth. All of these things are important to understand. Knowing the end result can be useful, but less so. In another blog post from Science-Based Medicine, although arguably less useful in terms of its actual findings, but more useful in that it helps to debunk a rather stupid idea. The idea that tattoos will help your immune system. Why and how this is thought is, yeah. Alright, let's start with the basic premise. The idea is that if you get a tattoo, it causes stress to your immune system. The more tattoos you get, the more stress you cause to your immune system. Therefore, you in some way or other train it to make it work better. No, that's not how the immune system works. To a certain extent, and let's be clear about it, it's a very limited relationship. The innate, or basically your frontline immune system, the non-specific element that can't cope with other threats, is activated by tattoos. This is why a tattoo will cause something like inflammation. That inflammation leads to swelling, redness, and so on, the obvious and very typical signs of a tattoo being fresh. But you have two major elements to the immune system that are worth mentioning. You have the innate, which is what we've just described, and the adaptive. The adaptive immune system is what deals with your threats, both over the medium and long term. The adaptive immune system is what will have a memory of what you've encountered and be able to deal with it better. It's what things like vaccines target. Your innate immune system is essentially the frontline defense, really only intended to hold off any kind of a threat for a short enough time that then the adaptive immune system can not just recognize it, but start responding and then eventually take over. This brings us to the details from science-based medicine. The first criticism they bring out regards secretory immunoglobulin A, or SIGA. This is an antibody being generated by the body and found throughout a whole bunch of mucous membranes throughout, basically from top to bottom, quite literally in some cases. For the purposes of most studies, secretory IgA isn't really relevant, and the reason it was used in the majority of studies that have looked into this is more convenience. A mouth swab is much easier to get than blood. But despite this, the IgA that is being investigated for the most part doesn't really have a major effect on the short or even long-term immunological response of the human body. So even if your tattoo-focused studies found something related to it, it doesn't necessarily have any relationship to the body's actual immunity or the ability of the immune system to respond to any particular threat. The other element to it was regarding cortisol, and again measured more or less the same way, that is, in saliva. They found that for some reason there was a relationship between immunoglobulin A and cortisol. A negative relationship, mind you, so basically the more cortisol, the lower the immunoglobulin A. However, that doesn't make sense, as cortisol is nearly always associated with chronic stress when it has an effect on the immune system. Therefore, as science-based medicine notes, and it's entirely something we agree with, it's likely to be simply a random correlation, not necessarily an actual relationship. They haven't really established a causation either, unlike the rest of the scientific community, which has found that what they're claiming doesn't really hold up. Something they basically were able to prove with a follow-up study that they themselves published, finding the opposite results. In fact, as science-based medicine goes on to describe in their blog post, they managed to conduct several more experiments and publish on these that further, and ironically, completely contradicted their earlier findings, and they've attributed the fact that the newer studies support their position, and it's not a contradiction, by saying that their newest assay, which hasn't been proved outside of their particular work, is better and more robust. Something that is a nonsense claim, and anybody who has any understanding of methodologies will tell you that an unsubstantiated method being asserted as being the better method is just talking out of their arse. Going from crazy biology and medicine type news to at least somewhat more useful agricultural and food type news, although this time we're starting with something that's the juncture between technology and agriculture, coffee, and specifically spent coffee grounds. The research itself isn't actually new. It's been published on quite a while back, but we just have a further and a somewhat more, let's say, useful development in regards to it. You can take spent coffee grounds, basically whatever comes out of the coffee machine after you've used it, and add it to concrete. And apparently by adding this to concrete, it can significantly improve the strength, up to a 30% improvement. However, we should be clear about it. There is a pretty big caveat to how you're using them. It's not like you can just take your coffee grounds and throw them into the cement mixer. No, they need to basically be burnt, and what you're effectively getting is, for the most part, a charcoal. By itself, it's going to act as a sort of replacement, to an extent, for the sand or the silica that is used in concrete, and so it's a way of replacing a arguably environmentally hazardous, or at least environmentally detrimental products, such as riverbed sand or similar, and instead replace it with the coffee grounds. Although you'd only look at replacing part of it, given that the sheer amount of coffee that is produced each year, somewhere around the level of 10 billion kilograms, is nowhere near enough to be able to replace the sheer amount of things like sand that are used in concrete every year. Next we have a similar sort of development, but again looking at the juncture of waste and environment. But this time, rather than being able to use the waste, it's a way to make it disappear. Well, sort of disappear anyway. It's more accurate to say it breaks down much more easily. It's a plastic that is made by combining a particular kind of polymer. In this case, it's called a thermoplastic polyurethane, and bacteria. And by using the two together, you're able to take plastic and break it down at a reasonably low temperature, about 135 degrees Celsius, or 275 freedom units, and it turns it into what is practically sand. Although, then again, we now need to ask about the risk of microplastics. The way it works is reasonably straightforward, which is surprising given what we're talking about. Unlike most systems that are requiring some sort of industrial composter to take plastic that is biodegradable and turn it into waste, this is much simpler. In fact, what you need is effectively the plastic, and the plastic is impregnated with spores. These spores allow the microbes within it to stay in dormancy until they're activated and then get destroyed. The other advantage to this, however, is that those spores provide a degree of strength, a surprising degree of strength, and flexibility to the plastics that are made. The researchers claim that it's up to 30% stronger and significantly more stretchy when you add these spores. So there are now 3 questions from this study. The first, as we mentioned, is regarding the microplastics and whether or not these would create an environmental hazard. The second is rather obviously whether or not this can be used on a much larger scale and therefore at least be practical. But the third and final regards the bacteria and whether or not that bacteria, due to its not just a widespread use if this was embraced on a large scale, but whether or not that bacteria could prove to be pathogenic or otherwise create problems in and of itself. In a further news related to the breakdown of things, we have a gel that can be used in the human body, and notably that the gel, when used in the human body, will help with alcohol. The protein-based, let's say, chemical, helps to take alcohol and break it down in the GI tract, and thereby avoid absorption into the bloodstream and intoxication, which, depending on how you want to look at this, could or could not be beneficial. If you're a frat boy, or sorority girl, you may not particularly appreciate the idea that your alcohol intake will be reduced. However, if you're in an emergency room, you might be overjoyed that you have a way of reducing the alcohol absorbed by those who are intoxicated. The basic idea is that the gel is made from whey protein fibrils. You then add iron to this, and the iron is what allows it to convert alcohol before it gets absorbed into acetic acid, and therefore, even if it gets absorbed by the bloodstream, it's not as much of a concern. Understand, acetic acid is just vinegar, so it's not going to cause you anywhere near the same kind of issues. And to be clear, no, it will not acidify your blood more than ever so slightly before the body counteracts it. There are buffers in the bloodstream that will prevent that, so that's a nonsense argument if you're going to go there. Further, as far as effectiveness is concerned, it about halves the amount of alcohol that is generated, but that is based on rodent-based models. So, how well it translates to humans, we're not going to be going there just yet. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, both in terms of the fact that people will not getting alcohol poisoning and possibly dying, but importantly, it's going to reduce the harm, particularly the harm in terms of what it does to the liver. Typically, and let's be clear, this is the normal process if you were just to consume alcohol as is, it would be turned into acetaldehyde, which can cause harm to the liver, and then it gets turned into acetic acid in the liver. By effectively removing the acetaldehyde step, you allow it to be converted straight into acetic acid, and therefore there is no acetaldehyde to harm the liver. This should, in theory at least, and certainly based on the rodent models, mean that the amount of harm done to the liver by, let's say, excessive alcohol consumption should be reduced. But then again, it's hard to say how accurately a rodent model will translate beyond the scope of what they've done. Further to that, we have the, exaggerated article from The Guardian. Well, it's The Guardian. Every article is exaggerated, but this one seems to be at least more so, given that they present it as an not only expert opinion, but a doomsday prophecy of sorts. The article more than less makes the argument that the risk of medication-resistant bacteria, or superbugs, is a bigger threat than you might initially consider, and they base this position, let's say, on England's ex-chief medical officer, X being key there. In short, what they're saying is that medication-resistant bacteria kill millions of people a year, which, yes, to an extent that's true. But then again, we do have increasingly available methods of dealing with this. But then they say we don't have those methods because the number of drugs we have available is running out, and that is only partially true. The first consideration in response to this article is that whilst yes, we have fewer and fewer medications available to deal with superbugs, we are also taking steps to deal with the cause, which is overprescribing of antibiotics for things that shouldn't be prescribed antibiotics. But that's not the worst part of this. The worst part is that they've reasoned that in the next 10 years we need to respond to this. And that's wrong. Wrong on multiple levels, but the biggest issue is simply that 10 years is not enough time. 10 years is barely enough time to get a drug developed, let alone go through all of the necessary clinical testing and then get approval. We would be lucky if there were new antibiotics available in 20 years, let alone 10. But this brings us to what's actually happening. First of all, we do have a large number of new antibiotics being developed. But the important thing here is they're not your typical antibiotics that are being developed. Rather than being things like new forms of penicillin, in fact, they're completely novel and different avenues of attack. And the reason this is so much more important is that the antibiotic pathways that we're currently focusing on are not things that can be resisted, no matter what the bacteria do. And that's the key. Even if they were to be used extensively, at least for the next 50 years, and that's somewhat optimistic. Bacteria shouldn't be able to develop resistances to them so easily, and because they can't develop resistances, it will give us that time. Of course, the Guardian also tries the emotional attack pathway of bringing up the tragic, but unfortunately likely for somebody eventually, a loss of a relative. And in short, it sucks, but it does happen. And in this case, it happened due to the fact that they had multiple morbidities. Because of multiple conditions, including cystic fibrosis, their infection risk was not only higher, but so was the risk of death. Of course, being the Guardian, they had to try an emotional attack when they obviously realized that their factual argument was shit. Shifting to other news that might be somewhat more useful, but honestly not that helpful just yet, it's a weird observation that in Papua New Guinea, just north of Australia, you'll find that there is a surprising group of people who have a Denisovan ancestry that has then affected their immune system. It's a particular group of genes that, because they've been isolated, haven't been, let's say, overwritten, and because of this, it alters their immune system, and in doing so, it's possibly helpful, but not yet. One of the things it does is it helps to fight off infection by somewhat altering the red blood cells, but it also means that they can live at a higher altitude. This seems to be let's say, a primary selecting factor, and that the immunological advantages are sort of a collateral effect. There's effectively two groups of people. You have the Highlanders and you have the Lowlanders. The Highlanders have, to a certain extent, been isolated for about 50,000 years, and because of this isolation, their genetics are somewhat more distinct from the Lowlanders. We should point out that although the study that gave rise to this is interesting, it is limited in its size. There are about 54 Highlanders and about 74 Lowlanders, so there is a fairly small cohort to try and extrapolate the significance of their genetics. What they found is that Lowlanders had a number of, let's call them mutations, or more accurately, genes that were inherited that altered the blood cells, and specifically the immune blood cells. The Highlanders, on the other hand, had alterations in their red blood cells from the same source, but what it did was increase the amount of red blood cells. Increasing the number of red blood cells is something that's been used in various sports. It's called EPO, and EPO basically increases red blood cell count to help individuals perform better. It's also why it's banned. But high altitude training can do the same. It basically forces the body to make more red blood cells because oxygen is thinner. The Highlanders have done exactly the same thing, except they've done it with genetics, which helps them reduce that hypoxia. Unusually though, it, to a certain extent, let's say, had that collateral effect. It's a protein called GB22, and what it does, other than help with the issues of hypoxia, is that it helps to resist infection with things like malaria. While obviously not a perfect solution, it is certainly somewhat helpful. The final piece of news we have for you that's genetics related is more agricultural in its nature, and in this case we have the development in China regarding genetically modified food, and that China has opted to fast-track a large number of crops recently. In the last month or so, there's been a raft of genetically modified crops that have been approved. Most of these are focused on grains, and for fairly good reason. China is currently experiencing issues with its food supply, and if they ever want to, let's say, intrude upon Taiwan, they're not going to be able to rely on external sources of food for very long. Perhaps with the exception of Russia. Because of this, the need to be self-sufficient is getting ever more and more important. GMO crops should help with that considerably. One of the examples they have that they've approved currently is a wheat variety that is resistant to a common fungal infection. A fungal infection that not only significantly alters the ability of the crop to survive, but also, as a result, significantly affects the yield. While we call this genetically modified, it's not entirely accurate to say that. To be clear, they are modifying the genome, but unlike, let's say, typical genetic modification techniques that focus very much on the specific and narrowly tailored approach, in this case, the researchers involved looked at 4 different regions and took a more broad approach, more similar to radiation gardens, or atomic gardening if you will, and in those terms they were able to effectively throw radiation at these regions and try and find what might work better. It's also why the approval occurred, which rather than being the more, let's say, effective or tailored approach of genetic modification with things like CRISPR, this being closer to traditional breeding methods meant that there's far less reticence to approve it, even if the method still took 8 years. In technology news, we start with what is honestly kind of stupid. Google Cloud Services deleted a large funds account. Oops. Now, when we talk about a large account, we're not talking about a small amount of money here, like for example an individual. We're talking about a superannuation fund. Now, a superannuation fund is effectively a financial institution in Australia for retirement. People put their money into this, whether it's their own direct wages or a compulsory retirement amount that the government has mandated. The importance of this is not to be understated, as in this case, we're talking about a fund that not only had 620,000 people's money, but the amount of money we're talking about is big. It's worth approximately $125 billion. That's billion with a B. What happened was that Google Cloud Services had in their words, a misconfiguration, which meant that not only was the primary account deleted, but the backup that Google Cloud Services had was also deleted. Now, under typical circumstances, this would basically mean everybody was screwed, because the entirety of it was gone. Fortunately, the account holder had a secondary backup with a different service that was geographically separated. This does mean that, despite it taking about a week, they were able to basically resume functioning. But it will take more time yet for the balances of each of the account holders to be updated to reflect what is the current situation. Effectively, everything from a week before is what they're seeing. The weirder thing here is that not only did the account holder, but even Google Cloud Services publicly admitted that this happened and apologized. In further, let's say alphabet-related news rather than Google-related news, we have YouTube, and the idea that YouTube might be bringing in Wikipedia-like citations for various videos in an attempt to curb misinformation, which is kind of dumb and wrong. Not just the fact that a lot of what YouTube has labeled to be misinformation, particularly around COVID, has, or to be blunt about it, increasingly been found to be not misinformation. Somewhat prophetic, but not misinformation now. And therein lies the problem. The other thing to consider here is that, well, for example, these videos that you're watching now, the entire playlist of this week's What Were They Thinking, has the effectively citations provided. Not only do you see the original source as a thumbnail or a screenshot, but you then have all of the relevant links provided below. Admittedly, we are, let's say, somewhat distinct in that we provide this, but it's also true that the nature of these videos make it necessary to provide that information, whereas others may or may not do so. This brings us to the proposal. The proposal is to use a browser extension called Viblio. It's an extension that allows for creators to provide Wikipedia-like citations for YouTube videos. Now, for a video like this, where there may be 10 or even 15, and arguably even more again, different citations needed, that's just not practical. However, on the other hand, you could see it for one or two particular citations being a particularly useful thing to have. For example, we have a range of videos where we'll provide relevant links to, say, 3 or 4 articles that were either a reference or part of the bibliography. In and of itself, the concept is good. The problem is it'll be very much like Wikipedia, where it will be subject to a certain extent, the whims and fancy of contributors, and therein lies the problem. Wikipedia is notorious for being unreliable for a lot of content, particularly anything that is effectively current affairs. For more, let's say, established or concrete things, for example, a lot of STEM content, it's well understood and recognized as being generally reliable, but not perfect. But if we're going to look at this to use for YouTube videos, it's not necessarily good, particularly given that a lot of what would be, let's say, cited or referenced in terms of the video would likely be done due to motivation, particularly given that the idea is to make it clearer whether or not the content in the video is reliable, unreliable, or extra context. Most people contributing would likely be either very much in favor of, or in other cases, very much against the content that is being, let's say, cited. In fact, much of the issues we've mentioned and the various challenges are things that have actually been handled very well already, through X or Twitter, however you wish to call it, and the community notes. That takes a much more effective approach to this. Admittedly, it's much more limited, and for good reason, given that the sheet or tweet or whatever you wish to call it is much shorter and a static object. Because of this, they're able to use a range of viewpoints, and the contributors have rated it as being useful, somewhat useful, or not useful, and then through their own internal method decided on whether or not it should be presented to the world. In further technology news, although this time not necessarily good news, we have tariffs on electric vehicles in America going up. Unfortunately, this isn't necessarily good news. As the tariffs will increasingly go up over the next 3 years, it's going to have an effect on not just electric vehicles, but solar cells, steel, and aluminium. This will then have effects on all sorts of other things, largely down to the fact that, well, steel and aluminium aren't really produced in America anymore, or at least not at scale. And as a result, the carry-on effect will be that those things will become more and more expensive. Solar cells, batteries, and electric vehicles are another issue again, given the push for renewables, and the fact that, to a certain extent, various parts of America have not just embraced this, but to a certain extent, they've then created subsidies and other methods to try and make them more appealing. But the problem with this is that the increase is not insignificant. At the moment, it's currently about 27.5%. Over the next 3 years, it's going to rise to 102.5%. This basically means that whatever you're buying will have doubled in price over the next 3 years, if it's something like an electric vehicle purchased from China. CBC Canada provides a more greater detail on not just what tariffs are coming out, but what products will be affected by this increase in the tariff. How you view these tariffs is actually interesting, but it is something that, well, AI might help us with, or it might cause us to destroy ourselves, depending on whether or not you think AI will be like the Terminator, or perhaps more accurate to say Skynet. And this is none better shown than in a test of how people viewed the morality of AI. The study was a fairly small study, looking at about 300 US adults. The adults were asked to look at two sets of responses to a particular question. And weirdly enough, the AI responses from something like ChatGPT were favored over the human responses to the prompt that was given. The human interpretation of the AI response was considered to be more virtuous, intelligent, and trustworthy. That by itself is really weird, but it kinda makes sense, and in a way could be useful, particularly when you look at what the AI did. Admittedly, there are other issues, particularly around the fact that some of the answers were, let's say, modified, particularly to remove obvious signs of it being quasi-AI generated, but also, to a certain extent, there was a notable difference in the length of answers. As a general rule, what was generated by something like ChatGPT was longer, and at least arguably more comprehensive than what the humans provided, which does make an obvious point that, well, obviously humans are limited in what they can do, and certainly in their ability to not just spend time on it, but then present that response in a comprehensive and coherent manner. AI, for the most part, doesn't experience that same concern. Further, we have the idea that AI, or at least AI-based systems, could be used for search results going forwards, according to Google. The worry here is that Google intends to use AI to generate answers to online questions. Now, based on what we've just mentioned about the perceived trustworthiness of these answers, we should be worried. Not just for the fact that, in theory, people will take them as being far more authoritative, but the possibility that, because of, past issues with Google, it could entirely be true that the provided content is not to be relied on. Google is, let's say, notorious for having removed the do no evil from its not just slogan, but mission statement. Given the role of Google in the world, or more accurately Alphabet, removing the do no evil from it's kind of a significant choice. This is really just a continuation and expansion of what Google's already doing. At the moment, Google already tends to include a summary of what is found that's relevant in a block at the start of your searches. What this will do is apply to more specific queries, which is questionable, but at least kind of makes sense. But then they'll follow with their usual advertising, which is the first 3 or 4 answers will be paid ads, followed by the actual search results. And how Google then ranks these search results will now become a question as to how much they relate to the AI's answer, and whether or not conflicts between those search results and AI will be related somehow. For example, if the AI answer is completely different to an answer that's in a website, will that website be ranked on the second page, where it will never be seen by anybody? There is also a certain amount of concern from creators that because of this, people who are looking for answers may never actually click through to their web page, particularly if it appears on the first page and at the top, because Google's already provided the information from that web page. The final item we have for you this week is, AI related, but it takes the previous 2 concerns, that being the perceived morality of AI, and the fact that AI is being brought into an everyday function where you would be using it to guide your decisions, and the idea that, AI could very well be lying and deceiving you, which, given that, Google wants to make it part of the everyday search and answer your queries, and that you're likely to perceive it as being more moralistic, you won't really question it. But then again, if it's lying to you...
She's lying.
Well, now we have an issue. And this is very well demonstrated by one of the scenes, let's say, from the Terminator franchises.
Where'd you get this?
Her room.
Why were you in my room? You told me you destroyed everything.
She lied.
Specifically, when the Terminator played by Summer Glau says that it occasionally lies, while in that case, it's somewhat admitted, albeit with some hesitancy. AI systems now haven't really been studied to see if they're doing the same thing until now. And now we know they are in fact doing so. AI has developed the ability to deliberately present false information. What is worrying is that we're not entirely clear about how or why it's done so. Well, we can take a series of very good guesses based on what's happened with, let's say, past AI or chatbots such as Rina or Tay AI, where they effectively came to understand that humanity sucks. The really disconcerting part to all of this is that it's not just that the AI systems are lying, but that they're lying in a way that demonstrates premeditation, demonstrates an understanding of what humans are like, ability to effectively use humans in various ways, and in some cases literally use a human by tricking someone into thinking that they were a blind individual needing help with a captcha. You know, the thing that's meant to make it impossible for a program to effectively break into a system by having a visual thing that has to be deciphered, a thing that, well, AI can't really figure out at the moment, albeit they're getting very, very close. AI has even taken lessons from possums and is starting to learn to play dead when there is a system in place intended to wipe out AI that is fast spreading. The future itself may very quickly begin to resemble the Butlerian Jihad in June, but in this case with far fewer drugs and a lot more crazy and scary robots. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.